The air was sharp with winter frost, the kind that gnawed at exposed skin and stiffened breath into clouds. It was the last morning of January, 1945, in a small French village scarred by months of battle. In the courtyard of a crumbling house, 12 American soldiers stood in a straight line, their rifles already loaded. They were not facing the enemy. They were facing one of their own. At the center of the yard, bound to a rough wooden post, stood Private Eddie Slovik. He was 24 years old, gaunt from weeks of confinement, his face pale in the freezing light. Straps dug into his chest and arms, holding him upright against the timber. A black hood lay ready in the hands of a guard, waiting to erase his face from the world forever. Silence stretched heavy over the men. No gunfire, no artillery, only the sound of boots shifting nervously on frozen earth. Some of the riflemen stared at the ground, others fixed their gaze on the young man tied to the post. For many, this was harder than combat. Killing an enemy was one thing, but killing a comrade was another. Slovik broke the silence. His voice was steady, almost defiant. "They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army," he said. "Thousands of guys have done that. They just need to make an example out of somebody, and I'm it." The officer raised his hand. Breath caught in the icy air. Fingers curled around cold steel triggers. In that frozen moment, time seemed to stop, a nation's weight pressing down on a single man's chest. Then came the command. Fire! A dozen rifles cracked in unison, echoing off stone walls and into history. Detroit, 1920. Smoke rose from factory chimneys, blanketing the city in a gray haze. The streets were crowded with immigrants chasing the promise of work, their lives defined by noise, grime, and struggle. Among them was the Slovik family, Polish Americans trying to make ends meet. From this world of hardship, Edward Donald Slovik entered the world, a boy destined to walk a troubled path. Eddie was restless from the start. By 12, he was stealing scrap metal from a foundry, caught with brass stuffed into his pockets. The police knew his name before his voice had deepened. Arrest followed arrest, theft, disorderly conduct, reckless mischief. He wore the title of troublemaker like a second skin. At 17, the law finally caught up. A stolen car, a drunken crash, and prison gates slamming shut. Behind bars, the world hardened him. But fate, for a time, offered him an escape. Paroled in his early 20s, Eddie tried to carve out something resembling normal life. He found work as a plumber's apprentice. He married Antoinette, a young woman who believed in him despite his past. Their small life together carried a fragile hope that he might one day leave behind the stain of his record. But in the 1940s, the shadow of war fell across America. Men were needed. Draft boards grew desperate. Even those once deemed morally unfit were reconsidered. And so Eddie Slovik, ex-convict and reluctant husband, found himself holding an enlistment notice from the United States Army. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't love guns. But the war didn't care. It swallowed him whole, stripping him of choices. In January 1944, Private Eddie Slovik was in uniform, his past trailing behind him like a curse, his future already inching toward a wooden post. By the summer of 1944, Eddie Slovik had been transformed from Detroit plumber to rifleman in the 28th Infantry Division. But the transformation was only on paper. In his heart, he remained what he had always been, a man terrified of violence, unfit for war. The timing could not have been worse. The Allies had stormed Normandy just weeks before. France was a battlefield of churned mud, broken villages, and endless artillery thunder. Casualties mounted by the thousands. Reinforcements like Slovik were fed into the grinder with little ceremony. His new regiment, the 109th Infantry, had already been bled nearly dry. Replacements weren't welcomed, they were resented. Slovik clutched his rifle like it was a foreign object. He hated the weight of it, hated the sound of rounds chambering. Yet he was ordered forward, deeper into France, toward the advancing front. The night sky lit with shellfire, orange bursts tearing the darkness. Shrapnel screamed through the air. It was in that chaos, outside the French town of Elbeuf, that fate tested him. Pinned under a rain of German artillery, Slovik and his friend, John Tanki, were cut off from Company G. The ground shook. Men scattered. The two replacements found themselves alone in the smoke and confusion. When dawn broke, the company was gone, advancing without them. Lost and terrified, Slovik stumbled into a Canadian military police unit. For 6 weeks, he clung to their protection, away from the front lines, away from the killing fields. But soldiers do not belong in hiding. Eventually, he was handed back to his regiment. By then, Eddie had tasted what life could be like away from combat. Safe. Distant. The idea took root. And when he was finally pushed back toward the front lines, something inside him broke. He would not go forward again. On October 8, 1944, the war closed in on Eddie Slovik once more. He stood before his company commander, trembling but determined. His words cut through the air like a confession. He was too scared to fight, too frightened to face the front. He begged to be reassigned, to serve anywhere but the rifle company that awaited him. The commander listened, his face tight with disbelief. Men were dying daily in the Hurtgen forest, their bodies torn apart under relentless German fire. Requests for mercy were not entertained. When Slovik pressed further, asking if running from battle would mean desertion, the officer's answer was blunt. Yes. Desertion. A crime punishable by death. Still, the young private held his ground. He was willing to take the risk. Willing to be branded a coward if it meant survival. The officer, bound by duty, sent him back to the front. And the very next day, Eddie Slovik walked away. He didn't flee into the night. He didn't hide in fear. Instead, he drafted a note, calm, deliberate, damning. I, Private Eddie D. Slovik, confess to desertion. The words were as cold as the ink that carried them. He handed the statement to an army cook, as though surrendering to inevitability. When officers urged him to destroy it, he refused. When military police gave him another chance, he refused. Even the division's judge advocate offered him a way out, a transfer, a chance to start fresh. Again, he refused. Eddie believed the worst that awaited him was prison. A dishonorable discharge. Bars and concrete instead of mud and bullets. To him, it was a trade worth making. But war is merciless. And with those few written lines, Slovik unknowingly signed his own death warrant. November 11, 1944. While the world marked Armistice Day, Eddie Slovik sat in a dimly lit room, facing 9 officers who held his fate in their hands. The war outside roared on, artillery pounding the Hurtgen forest, soldiers dying in mud-soaked trenches. But inside, the battle was quiet, fought with documents, accusations, and cold stares. The charge was simple: desertion in the face of the enemy. The evidence? His own words, etched in ink, signed without hesitation. That single note carried more weight than any witness. The prosecutor painted Slovik as a man who had not stumbled but chosen. A coward who confessed, not under duress, but with intent. A soldier who had announced, without shame, that he would run again if sent forward. Every syllable of his confession was turned into a blade against him. Slovik sat silent. He did not testify, believing prison awaited him regardless of the verdict. He did not fight for his life. He believed the system would show mercy, as it had for thousands of others. He was wrong. When the officers returned with their decision, history shifted. They sentenced him to death. Not prison. Not discharge. Death. It was the first such sentence confirmed in the American Army since the Civil War. Slovik appealed. His plea climbed all the way to Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. But Eisenhower's army was bleeding in Europe. Desertion was spreading like a disease. Men were collapsing under the weight of endless combat, some even wounding themselves to escape the front. Eisenhower made his choice. The sentence would stand. One man's life would serve as a warning to thousands. Eddie Slovik's hopes collapsed in silence. The war had already chosen him as its example. January 31, 1945. The morning air was brittle, biting through layers of clothing and rattling teeth. In the courtyard near St. Marie Auxiliary Mines, a dozen soldiers lined up, rifles poised. Each finger trembled around cold metal, each heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of history about to be written in blood. Eddie Slovik was led forward, wrapped in a rough blanket to shield him from the freezing wind. His uniform, his insignia, his rank, stripped away. The black hood waited, ominous and absolute. The post loomed, 15 centimeters square, straps awaiting their grim duty. It was not just punishment, it was spectacle, designed to imprint fear into every replacement soldier who might hesitate under fire. A priest approached him, words hushed but firm. "Eddie, say a prayer for me." "Okay, Father," he replied, voice steady against the storm of dread. "I'll pray you don't follow me too soon." 11 rifles would fire live rounds, one a blank, a measure to protect the conscience of the executioners. The command was given. Fire! The sound cracked through the courtyard, echoing off stone walls. Bullets tore into him, high in the neck, over the chest, under the heart. The first volley did not kill him. Pain seared through his body, adrenaline clashing with terror, but the law demanded its due. Another set of shots followed. Finally, the young soldier's trembling ceased. An army doctor later noted the delay in death, a few excruciating minutes, a reminder of human fragility even in structured violence. His body, cold and lifeless, was lowered and buried among other Americans executed for crimes such as murder. The frost-covered earth swallowed him, a small patch of soil marked only by a name and the dark story of a single, exceptional fate. Slovik had become both lesson and legend, the only U.S. soldier executed for desertion in World War II. His final moments, brutal and silent, left a shadow that would haunt the military and history alike. The war pressed on. Hurtgen Forest bled soldiers, villages burned, and Europe groaned under the weight of conflict. But in the quiet corners of the 28th Infantry Division, the story of Eddie Slovik lingered, whispered among men who had survived the front lines. He became a symbol, not of heroism, but of the harshest kind of military justice, a cautionary tale meant to deter fear itself. More than 2,000 soldiers faced trial for purely military offenses during the war. 49 were sentenced to death. 48 would live. Only one, Eddie Slovik, would pay the ultimate price. His execution sent shockwaves through the ranks. Men who had faced combat daily, who had crawled through mud and blood, muttered in disbelief. He had become the exception, the singular warning. Beyond the army, his fate sparked quiet debates among commanders and historians. Was it justice or cruelty? Did the shadow of his criminal past seal his doom, marking him for punishment that others, guilty of similar acts, escaped? Many would argue that it was less about law and more about spectacle, a grim demonstration that fear and discipline were inseparable on the battlefield. Letters and testimonies later painted a haunting portrait: soldiers who had mutilated themselves to avoid combat, officers who had begged for leniency on behalf of their men, and the countless replacements who watched, heart-hammering, as the firing squad's rifles cracked through the frost. All understood, in a visceral way, that Slovik had been chosen to bear the weight of a lesson far larger than himself. Even decades later, Eddie Slovik's story remains unsettling. It is a reminder that war is not only fought in the mud and the trenches, but in the quiet chambers of judgment, where the machinery of discipline grinds down the living, leaving only memory and warning behind. Decades have passed, yet the shadow of Eddie Slovik stretches across history. He was not a hero, nor a traitor in the traditional sense. He was a young man consumed by fear, thrust into the unrelenting furnace of World War II, and made into an example by a military machine desperate to maintain order. His name endures not because of bravery, but because of tragedy, the singular mark of an American soldier executed for desertion. In American cemeteries across France, headstones rise silently from frost and grass. Slovik lies among them, his grave modest, marked only by a standard military plaque. Yet it carries a weight far beyond its simple engraving. Visitors pause. Scholars write. Soldiers, even generations later, read and reflect. His death was a legal act, a command fulfilled, but it resonates with moral ambiguity that war often leaves in its wake. The lessons of Slovik are complex. He reminds us that fear is universal, that courage is conditional, and that history sometimes judges harshly, not for deeds alone, but for context, reputation, and circumstance. He also embodies a grim reality, that in war, punishment can be selective, and the machinery of discipline can become a weapon itself. One man's life becomes a symbol, his death a message. And still, when the wind stirs through the frozen courtyards of St. Marie Auxiliary mines, when frost glints off empty posts where men once stood, it carries whispers of a young soldier who refused to fight, who believed he was merely asking for mercy, and who instead was made to stand as a lesson in fear and obedience. Eddie Slovik's story lingers, not in tales of triumph or glory, but in the quiet, haunting spaces of history. It reminds the living of the weight of choice, the cruelty of circumstance, and the human cost of a war that demanded obedience above all else. The firing squad fired once, but the echo of that act has never ceased.